a lot of great bar. Man, you're hitting their books and hitting their streets. Won't be hard to find. Tell you questions, asking me lies. Asking me lies.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lies, More Lies, and Damned Media Lies. The title of our podcast is a bastardization of Mark Twain's Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics, his media criticism of 19th century America. We'll look at the sins of omission and commission of today's print, television, and digital media in the line not only of Twain, but also A.J. Liebling, Alexander Colburn, and Beavis and Butthead. I'm Dennis Bro, journalist, novelist, film, television, and art critic.
And I'm Jaleesa DuGro, an independent journalist based out of Florida.
And we're Bro
and DuGro
going at the news. Okay, so our first segment is a piece about Germany's Merz in the New York Times, and in New York Times speak, Germany's Merz, a kinder, gentler Nazi. Germany's current right-wing chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is a descendant of Nazis. His grandfather, a mayor of a German town, which named streets after Hitler and Goebbels, and his father fought in the German army as part of Hitler's forces. Merz himself, famously, like Hitler, called for an attack on the city hall in his hometown of Brionne in Rhineland-Westphalia to overthrow the Red Town Hall, which was hardly red, just under the providence of the lawfully elected SPD leadership, the equivalent in Germany of the American Democrats or British Labour Party. Merz is presiding over the shift in German industry from a peacetime to a war footing. Under his leadership, as Germany has cut itself off from cheap Russian oil and natural gas, the heart of the European economic engine, the German auto industry is leaving, with Volkswagen recently announcing plant closings. Instead, he is overseeing a Germany where the only true industrial growth is in weapons. The new German economic miracle is in the development of companies like Merz's homeland, Rheinmetall, attempting to rival the U.S. war machine in its development of munitions and armored vehicles, with growth expected to be 5 times this year what it was last year. The Nazi descendant also has moved Germany closer to a compulsory draft, with this year a letter sent to all 18-year-olds asking if they would like to enlist in the army, all to fight the supposed Russian menace, as once again the country is being led into a panic to fight an enemy which has no designs on it, as in fact Russia instead leans east and is content to have the West sow the seeds of its own destruction. How does Western media present this extremely pugilistic figure? Let's take a look at a mid-December piece in the New York Times about Merz, headlined "Europe's Pragmatic Deal Maker," and which, in embarrassment at the puff piece, the Times later has changed to "The Turbulent Times of Friedrich Merz." And the turbulent times at the New York Times. Merz is presented as an Adenauer-type Christian Democrat, as sturdy at the helm of state as he is in piloting his own plane. It was Konrad Adenauer presided over, yes, the buildup of the economic engine of Germany, but also the rolling back of Germany's denazification as the country became a U.S. bulwark in the Cold War, with its former Nazi past forgotten in the rush to contain the Soviet socialists. Merz's is called a throwback form of leadership, that is, to a nostalgic, kinder, gentler period, evoking Adenauer's essentially post-Nazi regime disguised as democracy, though the author notes in passing that Merz is called, quote, the strongest leader standing among Europe's major powers. But he has lost support among his own people. The description is itself a kinder, gentler way of concealing that, as Reuters described it, Merz is, quote, one of the least popular chancellors in memory, with his ratings continuing to fall and with the majority of Germans describing him as untrustworthy. For the Times, though, with the ratings of his fellow warlike leaders, Macron in France and Starmer in Britain, far below Merz's own low ratings, which have 75% of Germans unhappy with his performance, he is in Times speak Europe's indispensable leader. His strong stewardship is shown for the times and is pushing to steal the $300 billion in Russian assets that the Europeans seized, a bid which luckily the European banks and the European financial structure failed, or the continent would be wiped off the investment ledger as a forever unsafe place to park money. The Times is betting and hoping that MERS can help prolong the war in Ukraine, a war Europe cannot win, and that every day sees Ukrainians either dying or deserting, many after being shanghaied into a military they understand is a death trap. A sign of MERS's practicality and prodigious statesmanship for the Times is that when he came to visit Trump last June, he brought a framed copy of Trump's grandfather's birth certificate. This is the grandfather who made the family fortune in the West in brothels, arriving too late to mine the gold and instead deciding to mine the miners, that is, ply them with alcohol and sex workers. So you have the descendant of Nazis flattering the descendant of alcohol and sex trafficking, and both having a good laugh over their being leaders of their respective countries instead of being tossed on the scrap heap of history. MERS, the story tells us early on without identifying where, has been, quote, shaped by his years in corporate law. It's only several paragraphs later, we find out that these companies include BlackRock, which will have a substantial share in rebuilding a devastated Ukraine, a devastation MERS is attempting to prolong by extending the war so that the cleanup bill from which he and his BlackRock buddies can profit will increase. We learn he is from a bucolic corner of Western Germany. This bucolic corner, part of the Rhine, was seized by Hitler in 1936 and became the cornerstone of the arms buildup that enabled the Führer to attack Europe. MERS's pragmatism is proved when, as Trump was imposing his tariffs on Europe, though there was minimal fight back as the old continent succumbed, MERS urged Europe to genuflect harder and stay on its knees, opposing even mild opposition. The author is granted a day with MERS, who he describes lovingly as acting like an exuberant salesman, upbeat about the German auto industry he is in fact sabotaging. The point of this story, at a moment when Trump was claiming he was making a breakthrough in ending the war in Ukraine, was that MERS was emerging as a leader who would not broker peace. In other words, as a leader in touch with his Nazi past, leading the continent into a devastating war, just like the last Nazi-led war, where Germany will again be reduced to rubble. How bucolic can you get? This story springs from the Times' globalist imagination, which is now in desperate times turned from domination through trade to domination through war, with Germany and Europe as the proxy sites of the war. This, in Times speak, is pragmatic. But what is most pragmatic about it is watching Europe be devastated. Well, as in the Second World War, America looks on and then paws its way through the rubble, panning for and sifting out whatever gold nuggets are still left in the wasteland. I wonder if you had any comments.
Sorry, it's just really interesting how history repeats itself, and we've found ourselves at the forefront of kind of the same situation that presents itself historically. Don't you find that rather interesting?
Yes. One thing you can say is when the contradictions don't get resolved, then history repeats itself.
Absolutely. And it will continue to every time. You would think that we would learn.
Yes, and that's what we have here. And that's our opening salvo on the New York Times. By the way, in preparing for this, I noticed that the article is still online for the middle of December, but they changed the headline because they were embarrassed by it. And so now it's MERS, a leader for tough times. You know, he's not, they dropped the pragmatic, kind of thing. So they're kind of retreating even from their own puff piece.
There's some praise now for him.
What?
There's some praise in there now for him.
Yes. So yes, he's, he's the guy we need in tough times. So anyway, so we have Jalissa here, and she has just come back from Minneapolis. So I want to ask her some questions, and we want to have a discussion. So Jalissa, tell us generally your impressions of what the scene was like. People are saying it was far more violent than showed up on the mainstream news, and that the violence was ongoing. What are your impressions of being there and being in the middle of it?
Thanks so much. Being inside of Minneapolis, I mean, I think overall the mainstream media corporate media did not do a very good job at covering this. My first impression was There was a lot of violence, but there was also a lot of coordination. This is one of the most coordinated states that I've been to regarding ICE, and I've reported in a couple states regarding just protests, ICE protests, and things like that. This is one of the most coordinated states that I've been to. I mean, they have a really strategic network through Signal, coordinating with each other on every single block on where ICE is. Effectively have these tactics to drive them out by using whistles. I didn't find that the people of Minnesota were violent towards ICE, to be quite frank. And I was there for quite some time, a couple days at least. What you often find is people gathering. You have citizens gathering at wherever location. In this instance, it was primarily at the Federal Whipple building. We'll say for like a planned protest. Basically just exercising their right to peacefully assemble, and then it being declared unlawful. And then, of course, law enforcement, ICE, the police, they begin enforcing these tactics of crowd control that then spins what is a peaceful assembly, as is their right, into straight violence, complete tyranny. To then, I would say, which is when legacy media decides to come out and bring their cameras in 6K to get the violence. The tyrannical protesters that are absolutely busting out taillights and being, just bringing violence into the state and worsening the situation. So it's like a really convenient mode of media framing. And that's definitely what I saw, because when I'm looking to the left and right of me, whether it's a peaceful protest, whether they're, employing crowd control tactics and non-lethals on the protesters, I'm looking to the left and right of me, and it's independent creators, independent journalists, YouTubers that are with me through the entire thing. And I'm talking hours at a time, because we could be sitting out there for probably 8 hours, maybe like 4 of those, nothing is really happening. We're just talking to people. You have families out there, you have couples, you have people just with signs that sit silently. That was my overall impression, is that the violence, in my opinion, largely is perpetrated by law enforcement in declaring these protests unlawful, but for no real good reason. Demonstrators are pretty good at regulating each other, especially these protest organizers who will tell, fellow people attending these protests, like, hey, they said, get back onto the sidewalk. Let's get back onto the sidewalk. Hey, don't throw that, or don't do this. Like, it's really coordinated. It's a really good network where they're constantly regulating each other in order to remain compliant. It's only at the order of, I would say, ICE or, law enforcement patrol leaders that declare these unlawful or try to disperse with non-lethals and crowd control that, of course, rightfully so, is going to agitate demonstrators. Right. So these are my first impressions inside of Minneapolis.
It's a great point that's when the mainstream media comes in. So it makes the demonstrators look violent when, in fact, they're retreating, from the violence that's being perpetrated on them.
Exactly.
But that's it, and it's odd, but telling that that's the image they want to get.
No, definitely. I mean, I don't even know how they know. Legacy media, it's like they can hear when a flashbang is thrown, because that's when they show up. You see these cars come in, and they're not even out there all day like these independent journalists and citizen journalists are. They're not. I wish I had just something more remarkable to say about that, but they're not. And I feel like that speaks for itself, because I think if you wanted to tell the whole story, you would be there for the entire time. I mean, I met some Swedish journalists that were kind of based out of Brooklyn for a Swedish network, and they flew in to into Minneapolis, and they were out there all day. I'm talking morning to night, every single day. Legacy media, they're like swooping in, kind of like this parachute journalism, getting one good like sound bite of, I don't know, a Somali saying like, yeah, we love Minnesota, we're not going anywhere. And then, boom, Fox News. It's like Somalis are taking over Minneapolis. And it's like, this is so convenient. I think if you wanted to get the whole story, you would be out there the entire time.
Right. And there's one Somali who's taking over.
One Somali. Yes. One Somali.
Okay. This is, as you said, very organized, persistent resistance to Trump, with even a Bruce Springsteen song now coming in at #1 in the U.S. and in 19 other countries. And with Trump continuing to double down after a moment of retreat, would you say this is a pre-revolutionary situation in terms of the organizing, or where do you think this will go in terms of Minneapolis?
I definitely.
What do you think will be next, in a way?
Yeah. I definitely think this is pre-revolutionary, and I think the administration knows that, which is why I think Donald Trump pulled those federal troops out of there, or the National Guard out of there, significantly lowering those numbers or that presence inside of Minneapolis as well as like other states, and saying we're not going to help the Dem states unless they ask for our help, because it's not helping. It's extremely inflammatory. This is only happening because of this quite excessive and completely, unnecessary and irresponsible policing, or just policing and surveillance inside of these states. So it's quite inflammatory. I think they realize that. And I mean, historically, Minneapolis, we saw what happened with, BLM and these protests. And so I'm only saying that in terms of what it could be. We've already seen far more activity inside of Minneapolis when it comes to protesting. So I think we know that it could have been, way more active than it was for just these protests. So what I see happening right now is I'm talking to people on the ground inside of Minneapolis. I have a couple friends out there, and things are dying down not in terms of ICE, because the ICE presence is still extremely heightened inside of Minneapolis, but in terms, I think, of those extremely large protests and maybe like revolutionary revolt types, what we kind of anticipated, because even myself, I anticipated that. I said, oh man, I saw what happened 4 years ago. I was like, this is probably definitely going to happen again. Should go out there and really see what's going on the ground. But surprisingly, it didn't go. We kind of like edged up to that line of what it could have been. And I think things are kind of dying or simmering. I think the pot is now simmering. I think the administration knows that and recognize that. I was actually quite surprised to see that he said, we're not going to help them unless they ask for our help, because, his attitude before was very brazen, as well as Kristi Noem, which I think maintains her position no matter what. I think that's just who she is. But, he was quite brazen in his statements that, we're going and there's nothing that you can do about it. And we're going to actually keep going harder and harder. And we're going to send whatever paramilitary group we want out there. And you just have to deal with it. And, basically, if you're retaliating against us, you're a domestic terrorist. Not that the domestic terrorist rhetoric has died down any much, but that police force and that like National Guard presence and things like that has dialed back. And I think that means something.
Yeah, there is the taco, Trump always chickens out, but that's from the right. What really happens is Trump comes up against the limits of his own and the U.S. imperial, the empire's power. And when he does, sometimes cooler heads prevail, and he realizes what he's doing doesn't make any sense and could have horrible ramifications. So he backs up a little bit,
Of course, but he'll never say it like that. It's always branded as like, well, you guys just don't want my help anyways. No, it's just not working. So this is completely ineffective tactic, and you just won't say that. So
he always has to get the win, Yeah.
And the last word.
Yeah, and when you think about it, Minneapolis is a hotbed. In the 30s, it was the occasion of a general strike in 1934. The George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter began in Minneapolis, and now it's a hotbed again. So these protests have sort of increased. They're increasing. Okay. What was the treatment of journalists like, and how were you treated? And what is flashbanging, and why is it used?
The treatment of journalists, I think that law enforcement, when they were deploying these non-lethals, did not discriminate between journalists and protesters. It was, if you're right in front of me, you're going to catch a non-lethal, and it's going straight to you. I got asked that question when I was flashbanged. I got asked that question a lot. Like, do you think that you were directly targeted? Do you think? I think if I was standing alone, even though I had a very large press vest and press badge, I think if I was standing alone, they still would have done it. I think if I was still in a crowd, they still did it anyways. They don't really care. I think that they're applying these tactics pretty broad and pretty generally. They just really don't have an interest in who you are or why you're there.
Mhm.
So how was I treated? Well, and then the question is, what was flashbang and how is it used? So I'll start with this. A flashbang is a non-lethal explosive device, and it's used for crowd control. It's characterized by a blinding light, specifically like over 1 million candelas, which absolutely overwhelms your eyesight. So you're temporarily blinded, I want to say, for like at least like 10 seconds. And then a deafening sound of 170 to 180 decibels, which obviously warms your ears. So now you're deafened. So it's meant to disorient its target, obviously for crowd control as well. So you're completely disoriented, you lose balance. So I was flashbanged. Actually, it has a very short fuse, so it detonates within like a second and a half. So it's quite quick. This flashbang exploded and it detonated right at my feet. And I was quickly trying to open my phone so that I could record what was happening. And I didn't even notice it landed right at my feet. And because I was looking down at my phone, it exploded right in my face. I had shrapnel embedded under my eye. I want to say it was aluminum or some type of metal. I had a concussion. The pressure, I don't really remember if I actually hit the ground because I was disoriented and hit the back of my head.
Mhm.
The doctors were asking me that. I
You
was
went to
told,
the hospital. You went to the hospital then, right?
oh yeah, I went to the hospital right after that. Initially I was in shock and I didn't realize that I was in shock. I was like, okay, like it's okay. It was just like a little boom. But then afterwards, looking back, I hopped right back on the camera. It wasn't even like 3 minutes later. I got right back on the camera. I'm recording and I can obviously see how disoriented I am. I'm usually, I can keep going without ums and ifs, when I'm reporting and I'm like sitting here disoriented, like, I just got hit by a flashbang. So anyways, shrapnel under my eye. They said that the pressure from the flashbang can give you a concussion.
Mhm.
And, so it was a little traumatizing, I think I downplayed it. I was like, it's no big deal. It wasn't that big of a problem. But then, when the effects set in, I had ringing in my ear. I had a tinnitus in my right ear, or excuse me, my left ear, because this was the side of the explosion. I developed a ptosis because of it like somehow affected the muscle in my eye. So I had like a droop in my eye. I had a concussion, obviously. I had bruises on the bottom of my legs because I was shot at multiple times. And I had a press vest. I wasn't chanting or protesting or anything. They said get off the street. I was definitely off the street. So, I mean, I think that this is extremely concerning, because if we're not respecting the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the freedom to report and be present at these events, I mean, what does this say for the future of journalism? It's
Yep.
basically, if you're not in, you're out. You have to either bend the knee, and you can only be where we want when we want. You can only be where we want when we say you can.
Mhm.
And that's extremely concerning. And so, I can completely understand why the masses are protesting this, and kind of going against these orders. It makes perfect sense.
You know, one thing is the way you describe it, non-lethal doesn't quite describe flashbanging, in terms of what happened to you. That's a little bit of a misnomer, can actually give people a concussion. The other thing is that it now has come out that some of the ICE people are being trained by the IDF, and the IDF in Gaza are killing journalists.
There are so many parallels between these tactics. I mean, they don't care if you're a journalist. They don't care if you're a citizen. They're shooting first, asking questions later. There are so many parallels between the two. I absolutely don't doubt it at all. I think it's extremely prominent what we're seeing here. So it's really full circle. What we're seeing overseas, the same behavior and tactics that we're basically supplying and funding and backing have Imperial Boomerang come back home to haunt Americans.
Sure.
And I'm kind of wondering if it's not what we needed to wake up, but I think a lot of Americans now are like, oh, it's kind of like this slow, oh, and it's like, yes, most of us were seeing it. But of course, you have your large genre of people that are like, well, what's happening in Gaza doesn't matter because it doesn't affect me.
Right.
And now it's come back around and it is affecting you, and it's affecting your neighbors.
Very good point. Well, could you just tell us some of the protests you've covered? Because you've been to a lot of places and in the middle of a lot of protests, and about what's happened to you in some of these protests. And do you see the violence increasing as you cover more of these?
Definitely. So I've been to California numerous times covering anti-ICE protests, anti-Iran, anti-war with Iran protests. Um, Let me think, pro-Palestinian, protests in support of the Palestinian cause. I went to the No King's Day protests, both the first one and the second one. I've been to New York City covering protests there, now Minneapolis. So I've been to quite a few, probably maybe 10 or less. So I've had enough. As far as, things that have happened, I've been shot at multiple times. I mean, look, I keep it right here as a souvenir. Give you guys, this is a rubber bullet.
Mm.
And to your point about non-lethals, it's reported in the LA Times, I want to say, that these shoot up to 200 miles an hour. And so they can cause internal bleeding if you're hit close enough. We just had somebody in Minneapolis, he lost his eye because
We've had that in France also. People have lost their eyes. Actually, because if it does hit you in the eye, it's going to be a major impact.
Absolutely. And some of these people are, they're going out there with the best equipment that they can get. And so some of these glasses are just not shatter resistant. They shatter. So anyways, we've been shot with rubber bullets. We've been pepper balled. We've been tear gassed. They have like, I want to say the equivalent of like a paintball gun, but with pellets. Mm. I've seen women be tackled, like completely tackled by 3 grown men. I've seen it with men too. And, you don't even have to be violent. It's just if you're just caught in the way, they're tackling you, I've seen journalist cameras be taken. I was detained my very first day in Los Angeles, my very first protest that I ever reported on. I was detained within 2 hours. I touched down in LA, went to my Airbnb in Koreatown. I went to South Alameda and I was detained within an hour. Wow. I said, well, I'm a journalist. And he said, well, prove it. And I'm like, here's my badge and my work is on the internet. It was the most bizarre thing. They Googled me right in front of me. He said, show me your work on, where's your work? Very bizarre. So anyways, I do see it getting more violent because, the administration has encouraged ICE, has encouraged, law enforcement. Hey, you can act with total impunity. You're not going to be held accountable at all. You can do whatever you need to do to get the job done. And I mean, you have these characters inside of, operating as ICE agents or law enforcement in general that are taking complete advantage of this. Yeah. I think when you don't have a check and balance, and obviously you're not holding the people that are supposed to keep us safe, law enforcement, not ICE or immigration and customs, but these people that are supposed to keep us safe are being used as, weapons against their own people, and they're not being held accountable for it, like in the killings of Mr. Preddy and Mrs. Good. I mean, Americans should be scared, absolutely scared. The people that are meant to look out for us are kind of being told to sit on the sidelines, and we have this new paramilitary force exercising, enforcing these heinous tactics against Americans, and we can't even do anything about it.
And they're masked without identification.
They're masked without identification. And, Kristi Noem, she's really interesting to listen to. She's like, these demonstrators, they're masking themselves and hiding their identities. We need to unveil them. And then she's like, please don't dox our law enforcement officers. They are trying to do their job. And I'm like, this double standard is just prevalent and prominent within this administration. But I mean,
and most demonstrators are not masked, let's face it.
No, they're not. Majority are not. And they're very proud to be out there unmasked. There are a few that are naturally, and that's fine. But, you have, they don't want you to be masked because now they're using artificial intelligence for this facial tracking technology, because there are, at almost all of these protests, I've seen ICE agents as well as, the local police or police department there recording, and they'll record your face. And I know they're not recording so that they can be like, this is what's going on. They're all out there. They know what's going on. They're recording for facial recognition purposes to store your data. Yep. And data fusion and things like that. so that they can use AI for facial recognition, detain you later, because that's happened where demonstrators have attended protests and then later been detained or tracked down because of this facial recognition through artificial intelligence, which is why they don't want you to protect yourself and cover up. They want you to, go out without masks and sunglasses.
Yeah. I mean, you also had, Starlink, which is used in Ukraine, has been used in Gaza, probably coming home and being used in these places as well. This kind of really advanced AI. Yeah. And, of course, pioneered in Gaza, and Ukraine, and now being used against US citizens,
So
Yep. Go ahead.
no, that was it. Absolutely. This now they're kind of proposing this mass drone surveillance system. I mean, we're going to be constantly under surveillance. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I think that there was I did another interview where someone was talking about in Gaza when they were offering food. This was a few just last summer. Or in the fall when they were offering food to starving Gazans, so they would send the oldest son to pick up the food, okay? But when they came, they had to walk through this narrow slit where they were photographed. And the idea was not to give them food. The idea was to get them on camera and have the facial recognition in place so they could really begin tracking them when they came back with the food. And of course, some people were shot when they showed up for the food. But, there's that. Can you tell us, what your impressions of mainstream media coverage? You've talked about it a little bit. Was it fair, impartial? Did it take the side of ICE initially and then hedge its bets since it became clear that public opinion was on the side of the protests?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, for mainstream coverage, like legacy media, corporate media, they were out there for not that long. They got their one or two interviews and then they left. They weren't there for the entire day. Like the rest of us were out there truly reporting on what was going on. So was it fair? No, I think in the beginning, they did initially side with ICE. I think for maybe the more left-leaning media outlets, they took more of a neutral stance, like more neutral language. But definitely you have obviously your right-wing media outlets like Fox News largely that, will always maintain the position of pro-ICE. But for the most part, I do think they hedged their bets once it became clear that the public opinion was on the side of the demonstrators, especially after the killing of Renee Good, especially after the killing of Mr. Preddy. And this is increasingly evident. You even have like large talk show hosts that I can't remember off the top of my head that are kind of now like doubling back like, hey, this isn't what you said you were going to do. You didn't say that you were going to kill American citizens, for what we said. Alex Preddy kicked a tail light out, so he deserves to get shot in the face 4 times. Like, you know what I'm saying? And of course, like we already established, there's absolutely no accountability to be held for these people. I mean, they're allowed to act with impunity. So I think now, like I said, it's even evident with the administration, he's kind of dialing back, not ICE, but those federal troops as, methods of intimidation or to go out there to kind of like cool and get the pot to simmer inside of Minnesota. I think people are waking up and realizing what they're doing. There have been countless and countless times where they've detained American citizens, or they've taken somebody that is here lawfully inside of the United States, or they've wrongfully taken someone that had to be released 8 months later because they're acting first and then asking questions later. I think people are waking up to that for sure. I think the administration realizes this, which is why Greg Bovino is out and they have somebody else overseeing ICE now. Because I think his time expired there. They're trying to, I think, give a new face to the entire operation in a way. Maybe we can paint it a little better PR wise. Maybe it's just different tactics or less aggressive so publicly. But I'm interested to see in the coming weeks how this develops now that Greg Bovino is not overseeing this anymore. But for the most part, I think that public sentiment is kind of shifting even slowly.
Mm-hmm. So there's a New York Times story at the height of the protests and the killings that asked the irrelevant question, how does this affect the elections in the fall? With a horrible but revealing headline, ICE tensions are raging. What's the political fallout? The writer compliments the reporters for a great story this week, looking at how Democrats are grappling with a way to talk about ICE raids. And we remember that the leaders of the party, Schumer in the Senate and Nancy Pelosi's henpecked or handpicked successor, Hakeem Jeffries, called for better training for ICE, meaning that with the training, the 3 bullets that killed Renee Good and the 10 shots that killed Alex Preddy could have been reduced to just 1 or 2 shots, thus saving ammunition. That's what the Dems were grappling with before the story took off, grappling with what they're always grappling with, how to keep the lid on things. The violence evaluated by the 3 reporters as to how it will affect the races in the fall, how Dems can avoid calling for ICE to be abolished and instead look reasonable. The point of view here is that street protests is only relevant as it affects the elections, where that energy is then meaninglessly channeled into wins for the Democrats.
The Dems suggesting that we have better training for federal ICE agents or just law enforcement in general is like some technocratic fix, exactly like you said, that we can just reduce this down to maybe better training so that next time it's 2 bullets in your shoulder instead of, 3 in your face. And then meanwhile, we have the Republicans that are, leveraging and deploying law enforcement like it's some, like wedge that they can just impose on the citizens at will.
Yeah, they just want ICE better armed with more bullets.
Yeah, absolutely. They just want ICE better armed with more bullets. Exactly. And then the headline, like ICE agents are raging. What's the political fallout? It's very loud, and it suggests that the main thing that matters is the electoral impact. And obviously, it's very apparent that they're not concerned with the structural violence that provoked these actions or emboldened federal agents in the first place. And I think that's what we really need to look at. And I think that they would have a much better, time during the elections if they actually catered to what would benefit Americans, which is like a reform in this policy or just a complete structural and systemic change. So, the media is like channeling this energy of these protests in light of the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy into like this ballot calculus. And it really just reduces us to numbers. It's like, and you know what? It also kind of delegitimizes exactly what's happening with the protests, right? It's like the concern after is going to be disingenuous. It's not going to be properly attended to. These very serious matters and policy changes and systemic changes are not going to be, changed for, I think, the betterment of society. It's really just going to be like another place. It's going to be like the immigration issue, right? Like you have 2 parties that are constantly, instead of a fixed policy or again, just a overall change all across the board, it's going to be something that we ping pong. And it's like, do we care about human rights and our citizens' rights or do we not? It's like, whatever's going to get us more votes. It delegitimizes the entire, I think the entire endeavor to solve the issue in the first place.
Yeah, I think in an attempt to bottle up what you and I, what I described and you seconded was a pre-revolutionary situation.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we're segueing into.
Yep.
And like we said, I think that the administration knows this.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And we'll go into another segment here, which I call Times Watch. This is going to be a regular feature on our podcast where I review and we comment on stories in the New York Times that illustrate the privileged status of those inside the Washington Beltway and the New York financial bubble. First up is a story about the new watchword introduced in his campaign by New York Mayor Mamdani, affordability. Americans are struggling everywhere to make declining wages cover increasing expenses, especially in America's cities, and especially due to rent gouging. So affordability was seized on by Mamdani, but it's a pressing everyday problem for ordinary people and has been since the 70s, where the condition of low wages and high expenses, especially in housing, education, and health care, have caused great distress. Not for the New York Times, though. One story asked the question not why Americans are beginning to be impoverished, but rather, how did the question of affordability gain such traction so fast? In another story, the Times described Mamdani as affordability obsessed. All this shows the Times reporters and editors and publishers whose salaries place them above these issues, simply locked inside the news bubble, isolated and so utterly out of touch with most Americans, as are their privileged readers and backers in the Democratic Party's House and Senate. If you have any comments on that one and affordability, then we
That's
can.
pretty comical. What is affordability obsessed?
Yeah. Well, affordability obsessed is someone who's not affordability obsessed, looking at it as an obsession. What it is for most people is, how do I make ends meet when I can't? You know.
You're mad. He wants to make things affordable for people.
Yeah.
He's just so affordability obsessed. He's just so, affordable housing. I don't like that. Like,
I know. Who ever heard of such an absurd thing? Yeah. We have our comfortable condos.
yeah, absolutely.
In New York, Los Angeles, Austin, Phoenix.
Those whores who want affordability. Sure.
Yeah, Miami. Okay, next up is the coverage of the attempt in California to levy a 5% tax on billionaires, an attempt which is gaining steam, though opposed by the Times and the Dems presidential candidate, California's Governor Gavin Newsom. The press coverage of the story focuses not on what the state can gain by this tax, negligible on a billionaire's wealth, but rather on how the wealthiest are fleeing the state in anticipation of the tax. One Times story, Google guys say bye to California, and you can see the two of them smiling, the two co-founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, smiling in the photo as the story glowingly details the money made by the two. But it's not until paragraph 7 that we find out why they're leaving, i.e. they're tax dodgers and do not want to pay their fair share of the expenses to a state that has been very good to them. The story is a panic-inducing recounting of the billionaires fleeing the state at the mere hint of a tax, as well as saluting their acquiring of that wealth. It's not until the last paragraph that we learn that, in fact, quote, the overwhelming majority of billionaires have chosen to stay in California. The Times, genuflecting in front of billionaires, aiding by upfront not letting on to why they're fleeing, making it at first seem like a lifestyle decision, and then telling the story from the perspective of the few who are leaving instead of the many who are staying, contrasts even with the Financial Times, which tells their story headlined, California's divisive billionaire tax much straighter, as befits their readers, the business class who need the story straight, explaining that California's healthcare system is in danger of collapse, and highlighting, as well as those leaving billionaires who are perfectly comfortable with staying, and studies to show that wealth grew in Massachusetts after taxes were raised on the wealthiest. The way the Times chose to cover the story indicates that their sympathies lie not with those trying to survive healthcare cuts, but the wealthiest 0.01% who want to pay the least. Any comments on this one?
The media framing is interesting. Obviously, we're going to frame it, on their fleeing, that it's for better intentions than they're leading on. So,
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah, and it's just, not bringing up why up front, also makes them look better, Looks like, they just like Austin,
just for them relocating the family. They're just family guys.
Yes, that's right. It's just a family. It's a family story. The last story in this week's Times Watch concerns AI, the scourge of teachers who are watching students disdain writing their own papers and instead having them written by AI. The Times, in their approach, which is on the side not of the teachers but of the tech billionaires fleeing California, uses a sleight of hand which Roland Barthes, a French anthropologist and media critic, referred to as inoculation. Just as in a vaccination, the author reveals a tip of the truth in order to better conceal the deeper truth underneath. Headlined, AI is coming to class. These professors want to ease your worries. The story concedes that the front line on AI in schools is in writing classes and the teaching of writing. The story begins with a discounting of AI by the director of Barnard College's writing program, who says that students use AI, quote, to do the work that we are here to teach them how to do, adding that AI is, quote, very bad at that work. But the point of the story is one professor who has learned how to, quote, accommodate to AI. The story is then told and presents the point of view of that professor who claims that AI helps with articulating and expressing ideas. Having acknowledged the obvious problem, the story then goes on to dispute this common sense claim about AI de-skilling students and making them less able to think and write, including an English professor who describes AI as our playground, our sandbox. Well, at the end of this story, which always carries a great weight since it's what the audience is left with, a Columbia University professor allows that with the addition of AI in the classroom, quote, this is an incredibly exciting time in higher education. That's not what my professors my professors who are friends are telling me. They don't find it incredibly exciting, I got to tell you. Rather than one in which professors are being outmaneuvered and driven from their classes by a device that, rather than teaching their students to think, teaches them that thinking and expressing their thought in writing is outmoded.
I'm not a fan. I mean, did you see that study that came out that the usage of AI or ChatGPT is affecting your brain? Like, it's actually, your brain activity is lower because you have a computer thinking for you or coming up with these ideas. It seems more of like, I understand leveraging it because I've heard both sides.
Yep.
Like, it's like, hey, this is the future, so leverage it, which is the truth. I mean, we can't escape that reality. But I also do understand, like, it kind of is making us, I think, less critical thinkers because you have a computer kind of coming to the conclusion for you for whatever it may be.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's really interesting. Of course, I kind of side with tech billionaires. Like, woe is the tech billionaire who's just trying to make our life easier.
That's all they want. Too bad there's not any money in this. You know, these guys are just doing it out of the goodness of their heart.
Of course.
The other, it has been also called de-skilling at several levels. But I think in the classroom, it is a bit dangerous because what you're de-skilling in the classroom, you're not just unemploying people, you're also teaching people that learning how to think is not that important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people learn how to think partly through writing by putting words on the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to lose that. I mean, we've already lost it with, I hate to say it, but like it's small, like Grammarly per se. Like we kind of have, this automated little tool that kind of tells us like, hey, that's wrong. Hey, that's wrong. Hey, that's wrong. Instead of asking the question, why is that wrong? It just kind of gives us the answer already. We're losing the idea to question these things further so that we learn through making mistakes. The thing is, we're not being allowed to make mistakes anymore or critically think. That's what it takes away from us.
Yeah, I have a friend and he has a very good Substack, which is very informed, but he says, without spell check, I'd be waiting tables right now, so, so it does, certainly it does help in these things, that's for sure, but it can't think, it can't reason. And that's a delusion, and it's a dangerous delusion that probably needs to be broken,
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, like we've begun to, I think, again, in my opinion, in some arenas, we're such an unserious generation. We've like memeified it or turned ChatGPT into something, or artificial intelligence, that of like a friend, something we can fight it, ask all these questions. They've always got our back, but you're right. It can't think, which is daunting.
Yes, for sure. Okay, I guess we'll conclude. I'm a little bit over reading this in this segment, but this is our last segment. I'd like to go over my short review of a BBC series on a working class young adult that reflects the network's own out-of-touch coverage with both the British working class and young adults, both in Britain and in the global South, thus stressing a link between the news and fiction areas of the broadcaster, something that is not usually touched on. We usually see that the BBC series, in series in general, like news is not related to series. They're completely different. And yet, maybe they're not. So let me bring up this. And okay, the series is called Waiting for the Out. Okay, and my review is called Looking for an Out, the BBC and Working Class Life. Waiting for the Out casts a middle-class BBC gaze on working class life. And here's the short article. BBC's production of the 6-part series Waiting for the Out seems to address not only its past failings in terms of prison series, like Sean Bean's Time, but also further the new obsession with working class life, as evidenced in the Emmy and Golden Globe winning Adolescence, both British series. The series centers around a supposedly solidly working class young adult, Dan, who is confronted with an abundance of shoe styles in a consumerist nightmare, then visits his brother, who, while languishing with his newborn, recounts a beating from loan sharks, and finally begins his day job as a teacher of philosophy at a maximum security prison. In between, though, Dan is focused on paternity. Would he make a good father like his brother? Would his girlfriend, who she reminds him he hardly knows, forego artificial insemination so he could instead be the daddy? And what is the meaning of the obsession of one of the inmates on his now grown daughter? Dan, who walks with a limp, a suggestion of an injury from his own father, who he's not spoken to in 25 years, then seems himself to be solidly working class, except that this is part of the deception. When he begins teaching philosophy to the rowdy inmates who, rightfully, can't find the use in Dan's reciting the now neoliberal preachings of John Locke, he turns philosophy into a series of cute conundrums. In response, one of the inmates who knows more philosophy than he does calls him out and suggests that the philosophy he instead needs to be espousing is that of materialism. Dan ignores him, having no use for Marx's dictum that philosophers have thus far only interpreted the world when, quote, the point is to change it. In the end, Dan, though his background is working class, reveals himself to be solidly middle class in his thought and outlook. His gaze on those he would reach is solidly that of the BBC's itself. He doesn't recognize the innate knowledge of those victimized by the system, but rather attempts to civilize them by making them accommodate to middle-class, safe, genteel modes of thought and being. Though the series is based on a prison autobiography, it has none of the actual grounded toughness of, say, 40s prison films like Brute Force, where the prisoner's inability to accommodate to the system that oppresses them leads to an attempt to take over the prison. Instead, here we have characters performing oddball prison rituals, smashing the walls, kicking chairs, trying to run out of the classroom, with the teacher's goal being to sanitize them. The exception to this rule, and the only honest character in the series, is a black female prison guard who, out of genuine working class affection, though she claims it's only part of her job, accompanies Dan to the infirmary after his weak foot begins bleeding, and then tells him he has actually reached his students. The focus on paternity is part of this socializing. Will Dan learn to accept his father's cruelty, thus making him a candidate for fatherhood himself? His single-minded obsession at such a young age with being a parent, besides his girlfriend and his brother, he also stares at the child of an inmate before he goes into the prison, is, though the series seems to see it as a sign of maturity, rather another step at a time in life when rebellion and questioning is key towards interpolation into a social order with nary and not a whit of protest against it. What is the BBC, which elsewhere in the news coverage cheers on the Israeli-U.S. attempt to topple Iran and thus induce more suffering on its ordinary population, up to here? The network tried one prison series, Time, where the focus was not on Sean Bean's prisoner, but on a prison guard, and which was hardly effective. The station is also acutely aware of having to match Netflix's Adolescence, which in the end sees working-class men and boys as villains, and so is prized by mainstream outlets, but still had a solid focus on its working class characters. So the BBC, as usual, taking the middle ground, has as its focus a middle class character disguised as working class, set amongst caricatured working class reprobates whose rebellion, instead of being channeled into actively opposing the system which has exploited them, is instead in the form of our hero siphoned off into metaphysical questions about purpose and freedom. This focus makes a mockery of their lack of each, instead of addressing the means by which they could both create through struggle a genuine purpose and move toward actual, not delusional freedom. Ultimately, there is, as Hamlet says to Horatio, more in heaven and earth and in the prison setting he finds himself than are dreamt of in Dan's philosophy. And that's my attempt to kind of talk about how the BBC, which seems to erect a wall between its news coverage and its fiction, actually does not. Is actually that it's not a wall, it's actually seamless.
Very well said.
Thank you. All right. I think we've reached the end, probably of the audience's tolerance and also of our podcast this time. So this is so signing off. This is Bro and okay, Goin at the news, which most often does not tell us, to use Walter Cronkite's words, the way it is. So we'll see you next time when we'll be back with more lies.